In a small southern town, a young boy uncovers a buried truth that could change everything for an old widow and the entire community. An innocent search for treasure uncovers a mystery that exposes lies, changes hearts, and reveals a truth so powerful it brings a town to its knees. What started as a boy's quest for adventure turns into a fight for justice and redemption. As the secrets unravel, the town will be forced to face its darkest truths. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. James was a bright, curious 12-year-old boy with a restless imagination and a heart full of dreams. Living in a small, tightly knit southern town during the 1960s, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life in his modest neighborhood. The cobblestone streets, lined with weathered houses and peeling paint, carried echoes of a more prosperous past. Yet for James, these streets were alive with possibilities, each corner holding the promise of an untold story. James's days were filled with a mix of chores, schoolwork, and an unquenchable thirst for adventure. Though he was often teased by his peers for his insatiable curiosity, his mother admired his ambition. She worried, however, about his tendency to wander into places where he didn't belong. She would caution him, saying, "James, the world isn't always kind to boys like you. Keep your head low and stay out of trouble." But James couldn't help himself. His dreams weren't of keeping his head low, but of rising above, of doing something that mattered. One figure in the town particularly fascinated James: Mrs. Evelyn Harper, an elderly widow who lived alone in the grand, crumbling mansion that loomed at the edge of town. Once a symbol of wealth and prestige, the mansion had fallen into disrepair, much like its owner's reputation. Mrs. Harper rarely ventured outside, and when she did, she was met with whispers and wary glances. The townsfolk spoke of her as if she were a ghost, weaving tales of her late husband's dubious dealings and hinting at a hidden treasure that lay buried on her estate. For James, the mansion wasn't a place to fear, but a mystery to unravel. He would often linger near the property's wrought iron gates, peering through the ivy-covered bars and imagining what secrets might lie within. He'd heard the stories, the treasure hidden somewhere on the grounds, the rumors of its cursed nature. But what caught his attention most was Mrs. Harper herself. Though the town saw her as an outcast, James saw something different. A lonely woman whose eyes, even from a distance, carried a sadness he couldn't quite understand. One warm afternoon, James got his first chance to interact with the enigmatic widow. He spotted her struggling with a heavy bag of groceries on her way home from the town's general store. Ignoring the whispers of passers-by, he ran to her side and offered to help. Mrs. Harper hesitated, her sharp blue eyes scanning him as if trying to determine his intentions. Finally, she nodded, allowing him to take the bag. As they walked in silence, James felt the weight of her presence. She didn't say much, but her guarded demeanor spoke volumes. When they reached the gates of her mansion, she paused and looked at him closely, as if seeing something in him that she hadn't seen in others. "You're not afraid of me like the rest of them, are you?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. James shook his head, his curiosity outweighing any fear. That brief encounter stayed with James. It wasn't just the allure of the treasure or the mystery of the mansion that drew him back. It was a feeling that Mrs. Harper, despite her prickly exterior, had opened a door, albeit a small one, into a world that the rest of the town had shut out. For James, this wasn't just about finding riches. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried, just like the mansion itself, under layers of neglect and misunderstanding. The stage was set. James's world was about to change in ways he could never have imagined, and it all began with a small act of kindness and a burning desire to uncover the hidden stories of a forgotten place. The legend had been whispered in the town for generations. Somewhere on the Harper estate lay a treasure hidden by Mrs. Harper's late husband. Depending on who told the story, the treasure was either stolen riches or a reward from a mysterious benefactor. Some claimed it was cursed, bringing ruin to anyone who sought it. Others believed it to be a redemption tale, meant for someone with a pure heart to uncover. For James, the legend was irresistible. A chance to prove himself and maybe even change his and his mother's fortunes. One summer evening, as James lay in bed, the words of the old story echoed in his mind. He had heard it from one of the older boys who loved to taunt him. "You think you're so brave. Why don't you go find the treasure? Or are you scared you'll end up cursed like the rest of them?" The challenge had been made, and James couldn't shake the thought. The idea of adventure, of uncovering something hidden, was too powerful to ignore. The next morning, he made up his mind. He packed a small bag with essentials, an old flashlight, a notebook, and a peanut butter sandwich, and set out for the Harper estate. He waited until he was sure no one was watching before slipping through a gap in the rusted iron fence. The garden was wild and overgrown, with tangled vines and towering weeds obscuring much of the view. It felt as though time itself had forgotten this place. James treaded carefully, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. As he wandered deeper, he began to notice strange markings carved into the stone walls and tree trunks. Symbols he didn't recognize, but felt sure were part of a larger puzzle. At the base of an old oak tree, James's fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He crouched down, pushing aside the moss and dirt to reveal a rusted key. Its intricate design hinted at its age, and James couldn't help but wonder what it might unlock. He slipped it into his pocket, his curiosity now fully ignited. Over the next few days, James returned to the estate whenever he could, exploring different parts of the property. He kept his findings to himself, knowing the other kids would only mock him if they found out. But his visits didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Harper, always watchful from her window, began to suspect that James was up to something. One afternoon, as James examined the markings near an old stone bench, he heard her voice behind him. "You've been busy," she said, her tone calm but sharp. James froze, unsure of how to respond. Slowly, he turned to face her, expecting anger. Instead, her expression was one of cautious curiosity. I didn't mean to trespass," James stammered, clutching the notebook where he'd been sketching the symbols. Mrs. Harper stepped closer, her gaze shifting between James and the markings. "You think you're the first one to come looking for answers here?" she asked, her voice tinged with something that sounded like sadness. "The truth isn't always where you think it is. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight." Her words lingered in James's mind as he continued his search. They felt like a clue, though he couldn't quite piece together what they meant. The suspense only grew when, after days of searching, he stumbled upon what appeared to be a partially buried chest near the edge of the garden. Its wooden exterior was rotted, and the hinges were covered in rust. James tried the key, but it didn't fit. Frustrated yet determined, he realized this was only the beginning. The chest, and whatever it contained, was locked away behind layers of mystery. As he stood over it, a mix of excitement and apprehension coursing through him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this treasure hunt was about more than gold or riches. There was a story buried here, one that the town had long forgotten, or perhaps chosen to ignore. With every discovery, James felt closer to something profound, but the path ahead was far from clear. The questions loomed larger than ever. What was Mrs. Harper hiding? What truths lay within the chest? And what would happen when the rest of the town found out what he was up to? The thrill of discovery quickly gave way to the weight of the challenges James faced. Every spare moment was devoted to deciphering the cryptic markings he had sketched into his notebook, but nothing seemed to make sense. They didn't match anything he'd seen in his school books or the library. Each line, curve, and symbol felt like a riddle taunting him, just out of reach. His secret expeditions to the Harper estate became harder to balance with his daily life. Between school, chores, and his mother's growing suspicion, James found himself stretched thin. "You've been distracted lately, James," his mother remarked one evening as they sat down for dinner. "I hope you're not getting yourself into trouble." James avoided her gaze, mumbling something about extra schoolwork, but the guilt gnawed at him. The townsfolk were starting to notice his frequent visits near the Harper property, and the whispers grew louder. "That boy is getting too close to that old witch," one neighbor muttered loud enough for James to overhear. "He'll end up like her, an outcast." The word stung, but what hurt more was the way his mother reacted when she heard similar rumors. "James, you listen to me," she said sternly one evening. "I don't want you going near that woman or her house. Do you hear me? People talk, and I don't want you getting tangled up in things that aren't your business." Her tone was firm, but there was an undercurrent of fear in her voice. James nodded but said nothing, knowing he couldn't abandon the treasure hunt. His frustration mounted as he spent hours trying to open the chest. The key he'd found didn't fit, and no amount of prying or pulling would budge the rusted hinges. He couldn't help but feel like he was missing something, a critical piece of the puzzle that was right in front of him. Late one night, unable to sleep, James slipped out of his house and made his way to the Harper estate. The garden was eerily quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows over the overgrown plants. He hadn't expected to see Mrs. Harper, but there she was, sitting on the stone bench near the chest. She didn't look up as he approached, and for a moment, James considered turning back. But then she spoke. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the chest. "My husband, he was curious too, always digging, always searching." Her voice carried a sadness that made James pause. What was he searching for? James asked cautiously. Mrs. Harper sighed, the weight of her memories evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Redemption," she said after a long pause. "He made mistakes. Terrible ones, but he wanted to make things right. That's what this treasure is about. It's not just gold or jewels, James. It's a chance to undo the harm he caused, a chance for the truth to come to light." Her words lingered in James's mind as he left the estate that night. For the first time, he began to wonder if he was in over his head. This wasn't just an adventure. It was a journey into the heart of something deeply personal and painful. The next day, as he searched the garden for more clues, he stumbled upon something unexpected. Tucked away in the hollow of another tree was a sealed envelope, weathered and brittle with age. Inside was a letter, written in elegant but shaky handwriting. The words were cryptic, hinting at hidden paths and forgotten truths, but one line stood out. Asterisk, to seek what is buried, one must first face the shadows. Beware, for not all that is hidden wishes to be found. Asterisk. James's heart raced as he read the letter over and over, trying to make sense of it. What did it mean by shadows? Was it a warning or another piece of the puzzle? The suspense was unbearable. But one thing was clear. The treasure was more than a mystery. It was a test. And James was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The deeper James delved into the mystery of the Harper estate, the more isolated he became. His once easy camaraderie with the neighborhood kids was now replaced by awkward silences and jeers. Still digging for ghost gold, one boy sneered as James walked past the local playground. "Guess she'll be cursed like her too." The mocking laughter cut deeper than James cared to admit, but he kept his head high and his resolve firm. He told himself it didn't matter what they thought. He wasn't doing this for them. Yet, late at night, when he lay awake in bed, their words lingered like a dull ache. Despite the growing tension with his peers, Mrs. Harper began to show James a side of herself the town rarely saw. During one of his visits, she invited him into the kitchen for tea, a gesture that surprised him as much as it comforted him. Sitting at the worn oak table, she spoke about her late husband, Arthur, with a mix of fondness and sorrow. "Arthur was a good man," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "But the world wasn't kind to him. They said terrible things about him, things that weren't true." James leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "What did they say?" he asked cautiously. "They said he stole from the company he worked for. she replied, her voice trembling slightly. But he didn't. Arthur believed in doing what was right. Even when it wasn't easy, he discovered something that could have exposed the corruption in that company. But before he could act, they ruined his name. And when he died, she trailed off, her gaze distant. They made sure the truth was buried with him. Her words stirred something in James. He had always seen Mrs. Harper as a mysterious figure, but now he understood that she was also a victim of the town's prejudice and fear. Her pain was real, and her husband's story wasn't just about lost riches. It was about lost honor. Motivated by her revelations, James intensified his search. One day, while exploring the estate's attic, a dim, dusty space filled with forgotten relics, he stumbled upon a wooden chest. It was smaller than the one buried in the garden and appeared to have been left untouched for years. As he opened it, he found an old ledger, its pages filled with faded writing and strange symbols that matched the markings he had seen in the garden. But before he could examine it further, the rickety shelf he had leaned against gave way. James barely had time to react as it collapsed with a deafening crash, sending boxes and debris tumbling around him. He scrambled out of the way just in time, his heart pounding in his chest. Dust filled the air, and for a moment he sat frozen, realizing how close he had come to being seriously hurt. The near accident shook James to his core. As he sat outside the mansion later that day, catching his breath, he couldn't ignore the growing doubts that crept into his mind. Was the treasure really worth it? He had taken risks before, but this felt different. The stakes weren't just physical. They were emotional too. The more he learned about Mrs. Harper and her husband, the more he felt the weight of their story pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in too deep. The clues were leading him closer to the truth, but at what cost? The townsfolk scorned his mother's worry, the risks he was taking. Everything seemed to be piling up, and James wasn't sure how much more he could handle. Yet, when he thought of Mrs. Harper's quiet strength and the injustice her husband had endured, he knew he couldn't stop now. The discovery of the ledger gave James a renewed sense of purpose, but it also added to the mounting pressure. Each new clue brought him closer to unraveling the mystery, but it also seemed to tighten the knot of tension and uncertainty around him. The treasure was no longer just a legend or a game. It was a lifeline to a truth that had been hidden for far too long. But as James prepared to follow the next lead, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. As the days passed, Mrs. Harper and James grew closer, their shared mission forging a bond neither had anticipated. For Mrs. Harper, James became more than just a curious boy trespassing on her property. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that kindness and determination could still thrive even in the face of prejudice. She began to share more stories about her life and her late husband, Arthur, painting a picture of a man who had stood for integrity even as the world turned against him. One afternoon, as they sat in her sunlit parlor, Mrs. Harper placed a delicate hand on James's shoulder. "You remind me of him," she said, her voice soft. "Arthur never stopped believing in doing what was right, no matter how difficult it was. You have that same fire in you, James." Her words stirred something deep within him, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was searching for. In Mrs. Harper, James found a confidant and a mentor, someone who saw him not as a mischievous boy, but as a young man capable of greatness. Their partnership wasn't just about solving a mystery anymore. It was about healing old wounds and uncovering a truth that had been buried for far too long. At home, James's mother began to notice subtle changes in her son. He seemed more focused, more thoughtful, and less prone to the small mischiefs that had once exasperated her. But she also sensed the growing tension in him, the weight of whatever secret he was carrying. One evening, as they cleared the dinner table, she finally spoke up. "James, you've been different lately," she said, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" James hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I've just been helping someone," he said cautiously. His mother studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Helping is good," she said, though there was a note of worry in her voice. "But be careful, James. Not everyone will understand." Her words lingered with him. She didn't press further, but he could tell she was torn, proud of his compassion but fearful of the community's judgment. Meanwhile, a new figure emerged to complicate matters further. Mr. Douglas Haynes, a self-proclaimed local historian, had taken notice of James's frequent visits to the Harper estate. Haynes was known for his obsessive interest in the town's history and his reputation as a man willing to bend the truth for his benefit. To him, the rumors of a treasure on the Harper property were more than idle gossip. They were an opportunity. One day, as James was leaving the estate, Haynes intercepted him, his sharp eyes glinting with suspicion. "You've been spending a lot of time over there," Haynes said, his voice slick with faux curiosity. "What's a young boy like you doing poking around that old place?" James shrugged, feigning indifference. "Just helping Mrs. Harper with some chores," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. Haynes wasn't convinced. "Is that so?" he said, a sly smile creeping onto his face. "Well, if you happen to stumble upon anything interesting, you let me know, won't you?" James nodded quickly, eager to escape the conversation, but Haynes's interest set him on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man would stop at nothing to claim the treasure for himself. Back at school, James's relationships with his peers continued to deteriorate. The teasing grew harsher, and even his closest friends began to distance themselves. "Why are you wasting your time with that old lady?" one boy sneered during lunch. "Everyone knows she's crazy." James clenched his fists, swallowing the retort that burned on his tongue. He wanted to explain, to defend Mrs. Harper and her late husband, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on his mission, letting their words roll off him like water off a stone. The isolation was painful, but it also steeled his resolve. He wasn't just helping Mrs. Harper anymore. He was standing up for something bigger. The treasure, the truth, and Mrs. Harper's dignity had become a cause worth fighting for, no matter how lonely the journey felt. As James and Mrs. Harper continued to piece together the clues, their bond deepened, and so did the challenges they faced. The presence of Haynes loomed like a shadow over their progress, and the growing disdain from the town threatened to drown their efforts in doubt. But through it all, James's determination burned brighter than ever. For the first time in his young life, he knew he was fighting for something that truly mattered, and he wouldn't let anything stand in his way. James worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of the puzzle that had consumed his days and nights. The ledger from the attic, the cryptic letter he'd unearthed, and the strange symbols in the garden all pointed to one final clue. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat in Mrs. Harper's study, poring over the artifacts with a furrowed brow. "Think, James," he muttered to himself, tracing the symbols on the ledger's page with his finger. Mrs. Harper sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly as she watched him with a mix of hope and apprehension. Then it struck him. The markings on the ledger matched the design etched into the base of the garden's sundial, an ornate structure James had always assumed was just a weathered decoration. "The sundial," he whispered, his heart racing. "That's where it is." They hurried outside, the cool evening air sharp against their skin. The garden, bathed in moonlight, seemed alive with anticipation. James knelt by the sundial, his hands trembling as he searched for a hidden compartment. After several minutes of careful inspection, he felt a small, inconspicuous notch beneath its base. With a firm push, a hidden panel slid open, revealing a weathered map carefully rolled and tied with a faded ribbon. The map, though fragile, clearly marked a location deep within the estate's grounds. James's excitement was palpable as he showed it to Mrs. Harper, who studied it with wide eyes. "This is it," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "This is what Arthur wanted us to find." But just as their discovery filled them with hope, an ominous voice shattered the moment. "Well, well, what have we here?" They turned to see Mr. Haynes stepping out of the shadows, his face twisted in a smirk that made James's stomach drop. He had been watching them. "Mrs. Harper," Haynes sneered, "I always suspected you were hiding something." And now I've caught you red-handed. This isn't what you think, James said, stepping in front of Mrs. Harper. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Haynes shot back. You've been digging up stolen treasure, haven't you? The whole town will want to know about this. Panic surged through James as Haynes reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notebook. I'll be reporting this to the authorities, he said, his voice dripping with triumph. And you, boy, sneaking around like a common thief. What would your mother say if she knew? James's heart sank further when he realized Haynes had likely been spreading rumors. Within days, the entire town would know about his secret visits to the Harper estate, further stoking their animosity toward Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper's voice cut through the tension, calm yet firm. This is my property, Mr. Haynes, she said, stepping forward. You have no right to be here, and you have no right to that treasure, Haynes retorted. This isn't about treasure, James blurted out, his voice cracking. It's about the truth. Haynes laughed derisively. The truth? Don't make me laugh, kid. Everyone knows the truth about her husband. A thief, just like his wife. Mrs. Harper flinched at the insult, but James refused to back down. Clutching the map tightly, he said, You're wrong. And I'll prove it. The confrontation left them shaken, but James and Mrs. Harper pressed on. Following the map's directions, they unearthed a small, weathered chest buried near an ancient oak tree. James's hand shook as he opened it, expecting gold, jewels, or something that would vindicate Mrs. Harper in the eyes of the town. What he found instead left him breathless. Inside was a collection of meticulously preserved documents, letters, receipts, and ledgers, all bearing Arthur Harper's signature. Together, they formed an airtight case proving his innocence. These are his records, Mrs. Harper whispered, tears streaming down her face. He kept everything. This is what he was trying to protect. James leafed through the papers, feeling a mix of triumph and heartbreak. This wasn't the treasure he had imagined, but it was far more valuable. It wasn't just proof of Mr. Harper's integrity. It was a key to restoring Mrs. Harper's dignity and clearing her husband's name. But as they stood in the quiet of the garden, cradling the chest and its contents, they knew their battle was far from over. The truth was in their hands, but convincing the town to accept it would be the fight of their lives. And with Haynes determined to discredit them, the stakes had never been higher. In the quiet of Mrs. Harper's parlor, James and Mrs. Harper carefully examined the documents they had unearthed. The room was filled with a mix of anticipation and dread, as each piece of paper revealed new details about Arthur Harper's past. The receipts and ledgers meticulously detailed business dealings that contradicted the town's long-held beliefs. However, it wasn't until James unfolded a faded, yellowed letter that the gravity of their discovery truly came to light. The letter, written in a shaky but unmistakable hand, bore the signature of none other than Mr. Walter Grayson, a now-deceased figure who had been a pillar of the community and one of Arthur Harper's fiercest accusers. The words scrawled across the page were nothing short of shocking. I cannot carry the weight of this lie any longer. Arthur Harper was innocent. The accusations were born of my envy and greed. The deeds I have done to ruin his name haunt me, and I fear they will haunt this town long after I am gone. Mrs. Harper gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Walter Grayson, she whispered, her voice trembling. He was the one who convinced everyone Arthur was a thief. And now this... James's heart pounded as he read the letter again, his mind racing. This changes everything, he said. If we can show this to the town, they'll have to believe you. But their moment of hope was short-lived. Just as they began to discuss their next steps, the door to the parlor burst open. Standing there was Mr. Haynes, his face twisted with anger and determination. I knew you were up to something, Haynes snarled, his eyes narrowing on the chest and its contents. And now I see exactly what it is. Hand those over. No, James said, stepping protectively in front of Mrs. Harper. Haynes's gaze darkened. You don't understand, boy. These papers could destroy everything this town believes about the Harpers. Do you really think anyone will thank you for dredging up the past? James clenched his fists, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. The truth matters, he said firmly. People need to know what really happened. Haynes sneered, stepping closer. And what if I were to say these papers never existed, he said, his tone dripping with malice. Before James could react, Haynes lunged for the chest. Papers spilled across the floor as the two grappled, James desperately trying to keep the documents out of Haynes's grasp. "Stop it," Mrs. Harper cried, her voice breaking. In the chaos, James managed to snatch the confession letter and hold it high, out of Haynes's reach. "You're not taking this," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. Haynes, realizing he wouldn't win through force, stepped back and straightened his coat, his face a mask of fury. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "No one will believe you. The town won't side with a boy and an old woman over a respected man like me." James shot him a defiant look. "They'll believe the truth," he said. Haynes stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Harper sank into a chair, visibly shaken. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you didn't have to do that. He could have hurt you." James knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "I wasn't going to let him destroy everything we've worked for," he said. "This isn't just about us. It's about clearing Mr. Harper's name and showing the town the truth." Word of the confrontation spread quickly, fueled by Haynes's attempts to discredit James and Mrs. Harper. Whispers filled the town, some accusing Mrs. Harper of fabricating evidence, others expressing curiosity about the document's contents. The growing tension was impossible to ignore. James and Mrs. Harper knew they couldn't keep the discovery hidden any longer. The confession letter, the ledgers, and the receipts were too important to remain in the shadows. If they wanted to change the narrative, they would need to bring everything into the light, no matter the risk. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows over the Harper estate, James stood by the window, staring out at the quiet town. "We're going to have to fight for this," he said, determination hardening his voice. Mrs. Harper joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "And we will," she said, "because Arthur deserves it. And so do we." The discovery of Walter Grayson's confession was a turning point, but it was also just the beginning of their battle. The town's long-held prejudices wouldn't be undone easily, and Haynes's determination to protect his version of the truth loomed like a storm on the horizon. But James and Mrs. Harper knew they had something far more powerful on their side, the undeniable weight of the truth. Mrs. Harper sat at her kitchen table, the documents spread out before her. Her hands trembled as she traced a signature on Walter Grayson's confession letter. "James," she said, her voice soft but weighted with fear, "I don't know if I can do this. People have hated me for so long. What if this only makes it worse?" James knelt beside her, his young face filled with resolve. "They've hated you because they didn't know the truth," he said. "This is our chance to change that. We can show them what really happened to Mr. Harper." Mrs. Harper looked into his earnest eyes, her heart swelling with both gratitude and trepidation. She had spent decades hiding in the shadows of her late husband's reputation, enduring whispers and isolation. The thought of stepping into the public eye again terrified her. But James's determination stirred something in her, a spark she thought had long since died. After a long silence, she nodded. "If you think this is the right thing to do, I'll do it," she said. "But how?" James's mind was already racing. "We need to get as many people to hear this as possible," he said. "The whole town needs to know the truth. What about the next town meeting? Everyone will be there." Mrs. Harper hesitated. "James, those meetings are where they gossip about me the most. They won't listen to me. They'll listen to the truth," James insisted. "If we show them the documents, the confession, the ledgers, everything, they won't be able to ignore it." That night, James went home with the weight of their plan pressing on his shoulders. His mother was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed. "You've been spending an awful lot of time at Mrs. Harper's," she said, her tone cautious. James hesitated, unsure how much to share. But then he remembered how she had always taught him to stand up for what was right. "I've been helping her," he said. "We found something that proves her husband was innocent. She's not who people think she is, Mom." His mother's expression softened. "James, I've always admired your big heart, but this town, it doesn't change easily. People won't want to hear what you have to say." "Maybe not," James admitted, "but if we don't try, nothing will ever change. I need your help, Mom. Mrs. Harper needs your help." For a moment, she was silent, her eyes searching his. Then, with a sigh, she sat down beside him. "You're a brave boy, James. Braver than most grown men in this town. If this is what you believe in, I'll stand by you." The next day, James and his mother began quietly reaching out to a few townsfolk, those they thought might be willing to listen. It wasn't easy. Some dismissed them outright. Others listened with skepticism, and a few flat out refused to be involved. But there were glimmers of hope. Mr. Douglas, the kindly owner of the general store, agreed to come to the meeting. "I never believed the rumors about Arthur Harper," he said. "If you've got proof, I'll back you up." Mrs. Harper, emboldened by James's persistence and the small support they were gathering, began to prepare for the meeting. Together, she and James rehearsed what she would say, her voice gaining strength with each practice. As the day of the town meeting approached, tensions in the community grew. Haynes, hearing whispers of their plan, began spreading rumors to discredit Mrs. Harper and James. But James refused to be deterred. "The truth is stronger than anything he can say," he told Mrs. Harper. On the evening of the meeting, the town hall was packed. People murmured and exchanged curious glances as James, Mrs. Harper, and his mother entered. Haynes stood near the back, his eyes narrowing as he watched them take their seats. James leaned over to Mrs. Harper. "No matter what happens," he whispered, "you're not alone in this." Mrs. Harper nodded, gripping the confession letter tightly in her hand. She still felt a familiar knot of fear in her stomach, but for the first time in years, it was accompanied by a flicker of hope. As the meeting began and the floor was open for public comments, Mrs. Harper rose to her feet. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, the documents clutched to her chest. "I have something to say," she began, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "Something this town deserves to hear." Beside her, James and his mother exchanged a glance. The moment they had been working toward was finally here, and the stakes had never been higher. The air was thick with tension the night before the town meeting. James and Mrs. Harper had carefully organized the documents, ensuring they had everything needed to clear Mr. Harper's name. The confession letter, ledgers, and maps were laid out on the dining table like pieces of a fragile puzzle, their power undeniable. But as the two prepared for bed, disaster struck. A crash echoed through the quiet house, and James raced to the living room. The front door was ajar, swinging in the night breeze. On the table, the papers were scattered, some missing entirely. "It was Haynes," Mrs. Harper whispered, clutching her chest in shock. "He must have come in while we were upstairs." James's heart pounded as he searched the room, but the most critical piece, the confession letter from Walter Grayson, was gone. "He's trying to stop us," James said, his voice filled with both anger and determination. "He knows if the truth gets out, his lies won't hold up." Mrs. Harper sank into a chair, her face pale. "Without that letter, James, they won't believe us." It was the proof we needed. James crouched in front of her, his hands on her knees. "We can still do this," he said. "I remember everything in that letter. The names, the dates, the details. I'll write it all down. We'll show them the ledgers, the maps, everything else we have. And if Haynes tries to stop us, we'll fight back with the truth." With renewed determination, James and Mrs. Harper spent the rest of the night reconstructing their evidence. James's sharp memory proved invaluable as he recounted every word of the stolen confession. Mrs. Harper, though exhausted, helped piece together the narrative, her hope rekindled by James's unyielding spirit. The next evening, the town hall buzzed with anticipation. News of the planned revelation had spread, drawing an unusually large crowd. Some came out of curiosity, others out of disdain for Mrs. Harper, and a few, like Mr. Douglas and James's mother, came to support them. James and Mrs. Harper sat near the front, their prepared evidence stacked neatly in a folder. Haynes lingered at the back of the room, a smug grin on his face. He clearly thought he had already won. When Mrs. Harper's name was called, the room fell silent. She rose slowly, clutching the folder to her chest, and walked to the front of the room. The murmurs began almost immediately, whispers of disbelief, judgment, and curiosity. Mrs. Harper's hands trembled as she faced the crowd. She took a deep breath and began. For years, I've lived under the weight of rumors and lies. My husband, Arthur Harper, was a good man, an honest man, but his name was tarnished, and I've suffered in silence ever since. Tonight, I'm here to show you the truth. She placed the ledgers and maps on the podium, her voice gaining strength as she detailed the story of her husband's downfall. These documents prove that Arthur never stole a dime. Instead, he was framed by someone who wanted to protect their own interests. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a mix of shock and skepticism rippling through the room. That's when James stepped forward. "There's more," he said, his voice steady and confident despite his youth. He held up the reconstructed confession. "This letter is from Walter Grayson, the man who framed Mr. Harper. It details how he falsified evidence to ruin an innocent man. Mr. Haynes didn't want you to see this, so he tried to take it from us. But the truth can't be hidden forever." The room erupted into chaos, gasps, shouts, and accusations flying in every direction. Haynes stood, his face flushed with anger. "This is a lie," he shouted. "You can't trust a boy and a bitter old woman." James turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "Then let the town decide," he said. "Let them see the evidence for themselves." One by one, townsfolk approached the podium to examine the documents. The ledgers were undeniable, the maps meticulous, and the reconstructed letter matched the stories they had heard about Walter Grayson's shady dealings. As the truth sank in, the room grew quiet. All eyes turned to Haynes, whose protests had dwindled into silence. Mrs. Harper, her voice trembling but resolute, delivered the final blow. "For years, I've carried this burden alone, but no longer. My husband's name deserves to be cleared, and the lies need to end tonight." The tension in the room was palpable as the townsfolk processed what they had seen. The weight of years of prejudice and misunderstanding hung heavy in the air, and the stage was set for a reckoning. The town hall remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Haynes stood at the back, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. He had been exposed. The walls of his deception crumbled before his very eyes, and he could do nothing but stand there, powerless. Mrs. Harper, her frail hands trembling, stood tall at the front of the room, holding her head high as she glanced at the faces of the townsfolk. Years of whispers and scorn had shaped her into the woman they saw before them, but in that moment, something had shifted. The weight of injustice had finally been lifted from her shoulders. James, his heart racing, stood by her side. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for her bravery, for the strength she had summoned to face the town. He could see the faces of the people around him, their expressions changing from disbelief to realization, from scorn to guilt. It was a slow process, but it was happening. They were coming to terms with the truth, and in that truth, they would have to confront their own biases, their own mistakes. Arthur Harper was an innocent man. Mrs. Harper's voice rang out, steady and clear, as she addressed the room. "My husband never stole a thing. The lies you were told were crafted by someone who wanted to protect his own wealth and power, even if it meant destroying the life of a good man. For years, I've been carrying the burden of these lies, but I'm no longer going to hide in shame. This town needs to know the truth." The crowd remained still, the weight of her words sinking in. James watched as the townsfolk began to look at one another, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of deep regret. It was as if the walls of prejudice and suspicion were slowly being torn down, piece by piece. It was hard for them to admit, but many now recognized the injustice that had been done to Mrs. Harper, to Arthur, and even to themselves as a community. Mr. Douglas, the kindly shopkeeper who had supported James and Mrs. Harper from the beginning, stood up first, his voice soft but firm. "We were wrong," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "We listened to rumors and believed things that weren't true. I've known Arthur Harper since he first came to this town. He didn't deserve what happened to him." One by one, other townsfolk began to speak up. They acknowledged their own role in perpetuating the lies. Some apologized to Mrs. Harper, their voices thick with shame. Others turned to James, recognizing the courage it had taken for him, a young boy, to stand up to a town full of suspicion and fear. Haynes, still standing at the back, looked as if he had been struck dumb. The truth was out now. There was no escaping it. People were no longer listening to his lies, no longer afraid of his influence. The weight of his own guilt was beginning to settle on him. But he remained silent, unwilling to admit the truth. Finally, Mrs. Harper spoke again, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "I know some of you are ashamed. I understand. It's hard to face the things we've done. But this town is capable of more. I've spent a lifetime hiding from you. But now, I ask you to forgive me for shutting myself away. I was only trying to protect my husband's memory, to keep what little dignity we had left." James stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the moment. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice steady and strong. "But the only way we can move forward is by owning up to them and making things right. This town doesn't have to be divided anymore. We can rebuild together. But it starts with us accepting the truth." For a long moment, there was silence. But then, slowly, one by one, people began to rise to their feet. It wasn't just out of obligation. It was out of a newfound understanding, a recognition of their shared responsibility. Apologies were offered, both to Mrs. Harper and to James, and the room filled with an air of reconciliation. James looked at Mrs. Harper, who was still standing at the front, tears glistening in her eyes. She had spent so long in the shadows, and now she was being bathed in the light of truth and justice. She had finally been vindicated, and the weight of the years of suffering seemed to lift from her shoulders. As the room continued to murmur, James stepped to her side, his hand gently resting on her arm. She looked down at him, her face softened by years of pain but now filled with a quiet peace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James smiled, the weight of the moment settling in. "We did it," he corrected. "Together." The townsfolk slowly began to leave the hall, the heaviness in the air dissipating, replaced by an undeniable sense of change. As the last of the townspeople trickled out into the night, James and Mrs. Harper remained standing together, watching the moon rise high above. The battle had been fought, and justice had been served. And in that moment, James realized that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't gold or jewels. It's the truth and the power it has to heal wounds, to restore dignity, and to transform a community. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they had taken the first step toward redemption. Together, the next day, the town began to awaken from the shadows of its own misconceptions. The sun shone brightly, casting a new light on the streets that had once felt burdened by years of gossip and distrust. People moved with a sense of purpose, their footsteps heavier but their hearts lighter. The events of the previous evening had irrevocably changed them, and though the truth had come at great cost, it was a catalyst for healing. As James walked through the streets, he felt the eyes of the townsfolk upon him. But instead of judgment, there was something new in their gaze, respect. He was just a boy, but in his quiet determination and unwavering courage, he had become a beacon of integrity. His actions had shown the town the power of standing up for what was right, regardless of fear or the consequences. The day after the meeting, Mr. Douglas, the shopkeeper who had been one of the first to apologize, came to James. "You know, James," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity, "what you did, what you and Mrs. Harper did, it's not just about one man's redemption. It's about all of us. We all owe you a debt of gratitude for showing us the truth and reminding us that kindness and compassion can change everything." James smiled, the weight of the past few days still settling within him, but his heart swelled with a sense of pride. "It wasn't just me, Mr. Douglas," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Mrs. Harper and my mom, everyone who stood by us. It's not just about doing what's right when it's easy. It's about doing it even when it's hard, even when the world tells you not to." The town continued to shift. What had once been a community fragmented by prejudice and mistrust was now becoming a place of open hearts. People sought out Mrs. Harper, no longer with suspicion but with a desire to understand, to learn the story of a woman who had lived too long in silence. Her neighbors, who once turned their backs, now came to her porch to listen to the tales of Arthur Harper and the trials she had endured. The bonds of isolation were slowly being replaced with those of empathy. Mrs. Harper, too, began to change. She had spent so many years hidden in the shadows, but now, with the truth revealed, she could begin to emerge. Her walls of defense softened, and she found herself not just telling her story, but actively listening to the stories of others. In doing so, she became a mirror for the town's own growth, a reflection of what it meant to heal, to forgive, and to welcome others into the light of truth. But the most significant change was in the way the town viewed its own biases. In the wake of the revelations, the townsfolk took a hard look at the judgments they had made, the assumptions they had lived with, and the prejudices they had let control their hearts. It was a painful process, one that would take time, but it had begun. As more and more people reached out to apologize to Mrs. Harper, they also turned inward, asking themselves tough questions about the way they had treated others, about the stereotypes they had clung to for so long. James had done more than just uncover a long-buried truth. He had forced the town to confront its own flaws, its own prejudices, and its own capacity for change. His bravery had inspired others to challenge their own biases, to think twice before passing judgment, and to consider the impact their words and actions had on the lives of those around them. In Mrs. Harper's story, they found their own. She had been the victim of lies, but more than that, she had endured because she never stopped believing in the goodness of people, even when they didn't believe in her. She had shown the town that redemption wasn't just a matter of clearing someone's name. It was about restoring dignity, trust, and compassion. The lesson was clear, and the townspeople knew it. Truth, no matter how painful, had the power to heal, and kindness, true kindness, was a force that could bridge even the deepest divides. But it took courage. It took standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the world was against you. James, through his bravery, had shown them that the greatest act of courage was often the simplest. Simply choosing to be kind and to seek the truth, even when it was hard. James's story would live on in the hearts of those who witnessed it. His unwavering belief in the goodness of people, his refusal to let fear or prejudice cloud his judgment, became a guiding light for the town's future. He would be remembered not just as the boy who uncovered a hidden treasure, but as the boy who reminded everyone that real treasures are found in justice, compassion, and the courage to do what is right. And so, as the town began to heal, one small act of kindness at a time, they knew that the most valuable lesson was one that James and Mrs. Harper had taught them, that it is never too late to make things right, to challenge your own biases, and to choose a future built on understanding, respect, and redemption. In the weeks that followed the revelation of the truth, Mrs. Harper made a quiet but significant decision. She stood at the front of the town hall once more, holding the treasured documents that had changed the course of so many lives. The dusty, yellowed papers no longer seemed like a burden, but a beacon of justice, a testament to the enduring power of truth and redemption. "I've thought long and hard about what to do with these," Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft yet resolute. "These documents are not just my husband's story. They are a part of this town's history, the town that wronged him, and the town that can now begin to heal. I'm donating them to the local archive, where they can be preserved and shared with future generations. Arthur's legacy will live on, not in the shadows, but in the light of truth. James stood by her side, watching as the crowd applauded her decision. In her eyes, he saw the quiet strength of a woman who had endured years of pain and hardship, but had never lost her sense of dignity. She had given this town a gift, not just the treasure of her husband's innocence, but the lesson that healing could only begin when people were willing to confront their own mistakes and extend compassion. The town had slowly started to embrace the changes, though it would take time for old prejudices to fully fade. Many people still felt the weight of their past actions, but the road to reconciliation had begun. More and more townsfolk visited Mrs. Harper, seeking her forgiveness, not just for themselves but for the community as a whole. The once quiet widow had become a pillar of strength, and through her example, the town found a path forward, a path of understanding, empathy, and collective responsibility. As the last of the documents were carefully placed in the hands of the archivist, Mrs. Harper turned to James. The two of them shared a moment of silent understanding, their journey having come full circle. James had entered her life as a curious boy, driven by a thirst for adventure. But in the process, he had found something far greater, a sense of purpose, a deep connection to a woman who had been wronged, and a community that was capable of redemption. "I'm so proud of you, James," Mrs. Harper said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've not only helped clear Arthur's name, but you've given me something I never thought I'd have again, hope, and the courage to face a future without fear." James, his heart full of gratitude and admiration, reached out and squeezed her hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Harper. You showed me what real strength is." For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, looking out at the town that had once turned its back on them. The past was behind them now, and the future was open, full of possibilities. As they parted ways, James walked down the familiar streets, the ones that had once seemed so small, so confining. But now, they were filled with promise. The people he passed nodded at him with respect, no longer whispering behind their hands. The transformation had taken root, and while it might not have been perfect, the town had begun to heal. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the town, James stood at the edge of the estate, looking out at the place where it had all started. The Harper mansion, though weathered and worn, no longer felt ominous. It was a symbol now, not of the past's darkest chapters, but of the resilience of the human spirit. He thought about how much he had learned on this journey, that justice was not a single moment but a process, often slow and painful, but always worth fighting for. He thought about the kindness that had been shown to him when he least expected it, the friendships forged in the fire of adversity, and the redemption that came when people, even those who had been wronged for so long, chose to forgive and move forward. As he turned to leave, James knew that his life had been irrevocably changed. No longer just a boy, he had grown into someone who understood the complexities of human nature, how easy it was to judge, and how difficult it was to truly understand. But now, he had seen firsthand the power of empathy, the strength of kindness, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the world seemed set against you. The town was healing, one small act of courage at a time. The shadows of the past were receding, and in their place, a new light was dawning. It was a light of justice, compassion, and the belief that even the most fractured communities could find their way back to one another. As James walked home, the stars began to twinkle above him. It felt as though the universe itself was smiling down on him, on Mrs. Harper, and on the town that had found redemption through the most unlikely of heroes. And in that moment, he knew that the lessons of this journey would stay with him forever. Lessons of courage, of standing up for the truth, and of the transformative power of kindness. The story had come to a close, but the real work had just begun. The road ahead was long, but it was filled with the promise of a future where justice, redemption, and kindness would always light the way. And as the town looked toward the horizon, they knew that together they could face anything,